Today, so we're looking at a passage here that is a consequence of something that has gone on before. And for those of you who were here in the first service, which I think is Alexandra, perhaps, we talked about a little bit about what David did. And what I'm going to summarize very quickly what David did and has said in the first few verses before what we read today. David is on his deathbed at the beginning of chapter 2, and he leaves some commands for Solomon. And there's a bit at the beginning where he tells Solomon, you must walk in God's ways, his commandments and his rules. And if you do everything right, then my descendants will sit on the throne forever. But then he goes on and he says 3 things you must do. First, you must kill Joab. Next, you must reward the sons of Barzillai. And then thirdly, I want you to kill Shimei. Now, a very quick sort of brief as to why he wants these things done. We sort of read a little bit here about why Joab has to die. David claims that Joab assassinated people during peacetime. I would like to point out these were quite happily or conveniently, these were David's enemies and leaders of Saul's army at the time. But Joab himself is a very powerful person who is quite capable of running the country. Some people have suggested that perhaps he might have been more powerful than David himself, and therefore would be considered a threat to the peace and stability of what David is trying to create. Barzillai, the second person, had helped David when he was running from Absalom. And Barzillai had brought lots of food and water and all sorts of fancy things for David's army to eat. And David wanted to reward the sons of Barzillai for doing this. And the last person, Shimei. Shimei had originally come out and cursed David for a number of different good reasons, and you'll have to obtain a copy of the first service sermon to find out why. But he accused David of seizing the throne from Saul, had insulted him, and then when David had come back into ascendancy, had decided that, well, actually, it might be a good time to apologize. And so he went up to David and apologized for all the things that he had said about him. And David had said that Shimei would not die. So these are the 3 things that you need to remember that David had said. First, kill Joab. Second, reward the sons of Barzillai. And thirdly, kill Shimei. So that's what's gone on before this. Now, if we have a look, hopefully the text will be on the screen. We will follow bits of it, at least the first section here. Oh, it's behind me. So yes, okay. I'll turn around from time to time. If you look here in verse 12, Solomon, it says here, Solomon sat upon the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Now, of course, what do you think? What would you expect from that? Obviously, according to the text at least, the throne is secure. Nothing needs to be done. The prince and the princess, or the king and the queen, lived happily ever after. What is important to note is that Solomon's claim on the throne is actually quite precarious. It's not a very good claim to the throne. Now, at this point, Israel had only had one king before David, which was Saul. And Saul had died, and David had, again, conveniently inherited the position through political machinations. And so how you transfer the throne to the next person has never sort of been formalized in Israel. It is important to note that, Solomon is he's David's 10th son, and he's Bathsheba's 4th son. In other words, he's not next in line for anything. He's quite near the back. Now, David actually has, I think, 19 different sons and daughters. I believe he sort of forgets who they are after a while. I suspect with 19 children, that probably would happen anyway. But Solomon needs to justify his legitimacy to the throne. And if you want, in your spare time this afternoon, after the dessert has hit you, go back and read chapter 1 of 1 Kings. And in 1 Kings, it's all about how this illegitimacy to the throne is overcome. And it mostly starts with Nathan the prophet telling Bathsheba to remind David of an oath that he had made that Solomon would sit on the throne. An oath which you will find no evidence for in the text whatsoever. But immediately after Solomon sits on the throne in verse 12, he begins to do something. He begins to start doing things. And so today's sermon is sort of split into those four little stories that we've read about. What Solomon did next. Firstly, he killed Adonijah. Secondly, he exiles Abiathar. Thirdly, he kills Joab. And fourthly, he kills Shimei. So we'll talk about these. And we'll start off with Adonijah, which starts off in verse 13. Yes, we have it up here. Adonijah, of course, the son of Haggith, one of David's wives, and as we said, next in line after Absalom, who has died at the hand of Joab. Joab is quite a violent man, but he is looking out for the best of David. He has David's interests close at heart, and also his own from time to time, but he is a man who David can rely on to make things happen. And he has removed Absalom, who started a revolt, and this means that Adonijah is next in line if that's how the kingly succession is to work. Adonijah, if you read chapter 1, as I said, tried to set himself up as a king. He is supported by Joab and the priest Abiathar in this process. And he throws a party, and everybody's invited to come to this party except Solomon, Benaiah, who is one of David's champions at this time, Nathan the prophet, and the fighting men of Israel. And in response, David has to move quickly to make sure that Solomon gets the throne, and so David throws a counter-coronation party. Solomon is crowned, Adonijah goes in after this and grabs the horns of the altar. There are some pictures, if you look online, of a four-horned altar. It's basically a little bit bigger than the pulpit, really, and there are horns in it, and you grab it for sanctuary. And after this, Solomon goes in to Adonijah and gives his assurance that if Adonijah behaves well in the future, well, if he doesn't, he will die. So here we are now in the text behind us. And what Adonijah does, he goes into Solomon's mum in verse 15, and he starts talking to her. And he says, you know that the kingship was rightly mine, but it passed over me. Now I have a small request. Because he doesn't get to be king, Adonijah makes a very small request. He would like Abishag. Now, some of you may be familiar with Abishag. She is a woman, a young woman, who is brought to the aging David's bed because apparently he can't stay warm anymore. One of the things at the time period, and if you read the stories of Absalom and Adonijah, is that sleeping with the king's concubines is essentially laying claim to the throne. Absalom does this in the foresight of Israel. It's a sign of virility, of royal legitimacy. You want a leader who can sort of show himself to be strong. This is why we have pictures of Vladimir Putin bare-chested, riding bears and all sorts of things. What do you want when you have a leader? Well, you want somebody who's strong and in control. And this is one of the ways that we sort of, that they laid claim to the throne and show this. But the problem is with Abishag, starts in verse 26, which is Abiathar. If you go back and read during David's time, Abiathar is actually one of the sons of Ahimelech, and Ahimelech had helped David when he was on the run from Saul by giving him some food from the... appears to be quite generous in what he tells Abiathar. He says, go to your estate at Anathoth. You deserved to die, but I will not put you to death at this time, because you carried the ark of my Lord God before my father David, and because you shared in all the hardships that my father endured. So Solomon is merciful and generous. After all, Abiathar carried the ark. This is a great honor. He shared in David's hardships. The problem being, of course, is that Abiathar never carried the ark. We have no reference at all that Abiathar carried the ark at all. So why did Abiathar deserve death, as Solomon indicates? Well, we've got that sort of little text above us in verse 22, where it says that Abiathar and Joab supported Adonijah. You see, David has actually never really announced Solomon to be the king over everybody else. If you read chapter 1, you'll see exactly how it comes about. It could very well be that Abiathar knows absolutely nothing about Solomon, so he just simply supports the next person in line. This is a logical and reasonable thing for Abiathar to do. Supporting Adonijah actually isn't a capital crime either. It is not deserving of death. And Solomon tells him, I will not kill you at this time, which of course allows Solomon to kill him later if he needs to. He makes no promises for Abiathar's safety. Unlike David, for example, when David met with Shimei, David promises Shimei, he gives him an oath, I will not kill you. But Solomon gives Abiathar no such promise at all. Our next person, of course, is Joab. Obviously, Joab must have been close to the grapevine here because he hears what happens to Abiathar, and so he runs off straight into the tent of the Lord, and he grabs the horns of the altar, seeking sanctuary. Note what it says in verse 28. In the second half of it, if we're there, there we go. For Joab had sided with Adonijah. That is why Joab runs into there, but he had not sided with Absalom. It wants to be very clear that there's a separation between these two. That's what the author of the text wants us to know. And Solomon goes in, and when he hears that Joab has been clutching the altar, he tells Benaiah to go in and strike him down. Solomon gives the order to kill. Benaiah is not so willing to kill inside the tent of the Lord. After all, this is the place where the presence of Yahweh rests. Now, the official reasons given for why Joab needs to die are in sort of verses 32, sort of 31 and 32. And the king said, this is verse 31, do justice, he said, strike him down and bury him, and remove the guilt from me and my father's house for the blood of the innocents that Joab has shed. This raises some questions. Why is Solomon so happy to shed blood inside the temple, or the tent of the Lord? Benaiah certainly thought that this was not something that should be done, because he goes in, talks to Joab. Joab says, nope, I'm going to die here. And so Benaiah comes out and goes and tells Solomon everything that's gone on. It's not something that Benaiah is willing to do. Why doesn't Benaiah go into the temple, into the tent, and pull Joab out? If you read Exodus 21, there are some verses there about what happens if somebody tries to claim sanctuary. So if somebody comes in and grabs the altar, if they're innocent, then they get exiled into one of the cities of refuge, and then hopefully you live out the rest of your days, hopefully in some sort of peace. However, if the murderer has deliberately planned to kill somebody, then they are to be executed. But the text in Exodus is very clear. You take the person out of the sanctuary first, and then you kill him. Solomon instructs Benaiah to go into the temple and kill Joab at the altar. Solomon breaks the law in Exodus to remove the guilt of innocent blood, as he calls it here. Why does Joab have to die? Well, according to the narrator, it's because Joab supported Adonijah, and that's why he died. That was verse 28 again. According to Solomon, it's because of the blood guilt that Joab had brought upon the house of David, something which David had never actually been concerned about while David was alive. All of a sudden, at the end of David's reign, blood guilt is something that David wants to be interested about. So which is it? Is it the narrator here and what the narrator said? He supported Adonijah. Or is it Solomon, what Solomon says? This is the blood guilt of David. If you look at verse 35, of course, Benaiah goes up and kills him, and then the king appoints Benaiah in his place. So far, this looks like Solomon is house cleaning. When Boris Johnson was miraculously voted in as prime minister, 12 people were sacked and 5 people resigned from that. There was house cleaning going on. Boris Johnson wants to bring in his particular cabinet. Likewise, I might suggest here, this is the same thing with Solomon, out with the old guard and in with a new group that is more likely to support Solomon. So that's Joab. And lastly, we look at Shimei. Solomon gives Shimei several commands. He takes Shimei to Jerusalem. And he says, build a home in Jerusalem. So have a look at verse 36. Are we there? Yes, brilliant. Build a home in Jerusalem and stay in Jerusalem. And he says to him very carefully, do not go out from there anywhere else. On the very day, this is verse 37, that you go out and you cross the Wadi Kidron, which is the Kidron River, you can be sure that you will die. Your blood will be on your head. And Shimei agrees to this, he says. Now, we're never actually told on what justification Solomon can command Shimei to do this. What has Shimei actually done? If you go back and you read the stories back in 2 Samuel, Shimei has already apologized to David and said, I'm sorry for insulting you. We do not know what sort of crime Shimei has committed and why it requires house arrest. Regardless, Shimei loses some of his slaves. And obviously this is some sort of financial and economic problem because he goes out of Jerusalem and he travels to Gath. This is not too far away, but he goes there, which is interesting because Gath is in Philistine territory, which means that there is some sort of a possibility to travel between the Philistines and Israel at this point. And remember that most of David's career has been spent either killing Philistines or working for the Philistines. So we've still got some sort of cultural connection here. Shimei goes down there, picks up his slaves, and he comes back to Jerusalem. And Solomon finds out. Have a look in verse 42. And the king summoned Shimei and said to him, did I not adjure you by the Lord and warn you, on the very day that you leave and go anywhere else, you can be sure that you will die? And did you not say to me, it is fair, I accept? Why did you not abide by the oath of the Lord, before the Lord, and by the orders I gave you? What's interesting, if you look very carefully at the text, is that Solomon falsifies some of the evidence in his prosecution of Shimei. If you look, the very first thing he says, did I not make you swear before the Lord? Did I not make you swear before Yahweh? If you actually look at the little section above there, from verse 36 onwards, there is no oath before the Lord. Solomon uses this to justify Shimei's death, but there is actually no oath there said at all. And secondly, that's the first bit. The second bit is that he says to him, do not go out there from anywhere else. On the day you cross the Wadi Kidron, you will die. Now, it's okay if you have no concept of the geography of Jerusalem. It's perfectly simple. On the eastern side of Jerusalem, there is a river. It's the Wadi Kidron. It's just outside Jerusalem. I mean, literally, you can probably throw stones into it from the walls at the original time. It's not very far away. It's right next to the city walls. But it's to the east of Jerusalem. And when Shimei leaves Jerusalem to pick up his slaves, he goes to the sort of the southwest. In other words, he has not crossed the Wadi Kidron at all. He has, in fact, stayed over the Wadi Kidron. He just happened to have gone south. What is the letter of the law that Solomon is referring to here? Is it you cannot go out, or that you cannot cross the Wadi Kidron? Solomon asks some very questions that we just read from verse 42 onwards. He has this whole selection. He asks him a series of questions, but if you notice that Shimei never gets a chance to respond, and maybe Shimei never gets a chance to respond because Solomon knows that he's kind of manipulating the truth just a little bit to get his end result here. Regardless, in verse 44, the king further said to Shimei, "You know all the wrong which you remember very well that you did to my father David," which, an aside here, David has sworn that he will not die for, and Shimei has already apologized for. "You know the wrong that you did to my father David. Now the Lord brings down all your wrongdoing upon your own head." And as a result of that, verse 46, the king gives orders to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck Shimei down, and so he died. And then, verse 46, the very last sentence, "Thus the kingdom was secured in Solomon's hands." What can we conclude about this? Well, remember what David said at the beginning, the things I said at the very beginning, what David had instructed Solomon to do. He said to, do you remember what he said? He said, "Go out, kill Joab, reward the sons of Barzillai, and thirdly, kill Shimei." But what does Solomon do? Solomon kills Adonijah, he exiles Abiathar, he does kill Joab, and he does kill Shimei. Look and compare and contrast David's instructions versus Solomon's actions, and you will note that there is a slight discrepancy between the two. Why do we never hear of Barzillai and his sons? Why does Solomon not reward Barzillai and his sons? Why does he go off and kill Joab and Shimei? Well, David told him to, and that would be the excuse. But he also extends those commands to killing Adonijah and exiling Abiathar. If you pop back, and I don't know if Alexandra can do this in time, but it's okay if you can't. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 2 of 1 Kings, where David gives his instructions, David gives his instructions and said, if you do these things, then the throne will be established. God will help you. If you do all of this, a line will be established forever. But Solomon is actually exceedingly concerned with his position as king. He is not secure in his position of the king, and following the commands of Yahweh and the rules and the admonitions is not enough. And so, in contrast to what it says at the beginning of chapter 2 of 1 Kings, Solomon decides to go out and take matters into his own hands. The desire for political power and for security is immense, more than anything else. And if you read the next chapter after chapter 2, chapter 3, the first thing that Solomon goes out is marry one of the daughters of Pharaoh. Solomon here is destroying or engaging in the destruction of his enemies, perceived or not, real or imagined. Karl Marx pointed out that all states are founded on violence, and this is the beginning of the Jewish one. The acquisition of power by the two most famous kings, I would suggest, in Israelite history is achieved through violence and bloodshed. There's an irony that a man called Peace, Solomon, living in a city called the City of Peace, Jerusalem, takes action to secure peace through bloodshed and violence. The man who brings in his kingdom with the sword will watch it go out with the sword. If you read chapters 11 onwards of 1 Kings, you will see the destruction of the kingdom, how the kingdom is beset by rebellions and violence, both internal and external. The mixing of religion and politics has a very long and sordid history, and no doubt will continue to be. And as Adventists, we are all too fully aware of, at least in terms of our eschatology, what's going to happen at the end, where religion and politics will no doubt doom us all. But it's the misuse of religion here that we need to be aware of. If you look at what Solomon does, he justifies what he does again and again upon religious grounds. He justifies political acts with religious rhetoric. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily untrue, although the narrator of Kings and Samuel will often throw his own little interpretations into this to make us doubt what Solomon and David are saying. But I will point out that everything that David and everything that Solomon has done, at least in this chapter, is very highly politically convenient. The best kings in Israel, David and Solomon, cannot bring about a decent government. As I said in chapter 3, the first thing Solomon goes out is he starts marrying foreign princesses and sacrificing in the high places. There can be no religious government on earth that does not fall. So that's one thing that maybe we can be slightly aware of, is that religion and politics is never a good mix. Now, as I said in the first service, most of you are very unlikely to ever become presidents and prime ministers, but we all wield power in particular places, and we all have a choice, like David and Solomon, to use or abuse that power, depending where we are. But I think lastly, one thing maybe that might be worth pointing out as well, is that God's promises are his to keep, and they are not contingent on you and what you do. David says at the very beginning of chapter 2 that if you, in verse 4, the Lord will fulfill the promise he made to me. If your descendants are scrupulous in their conduct and walk with me faithfully with all their heart and soul, your line on the throne of Israel will never end. This is what David says. But this is actually not what God said. To do this, you'll have to go back to 2 Samuel, and it's okay that you don't have it here, but 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verses 11 onwards, where it's actually God who promises David that your house and your kingship shall ever be secure before you. Your throne will be established forever. In other words, God is the one who is going to establish the throne, not David and not Solomon. God, when he talks to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, does not attach any conditions to his promises to David, contrary to what David tells Solomon. God is the one who establishes the throne and the succession, regardless of what David's descendants will and will not do. Now, yes, God will sort of bring in punishments and whatnots to keep everybody in line, but the throne of David is God's to maintain, not the people on it. David and Solomon both thought that they needed to take certain actions to make the kingdom safe and secure. And maybe they were right. Maybe they were just trying to grab as much power as they possibly could. But as far as God was concerned, God was going to guarantee the throne, not them or their actions. It's God's promises that keeps the throne intact, not the actions of David, not the removing of problematic elements by Solomon. The throne exists regardless of David and Solomon. Now today you might sit here as a Christian, or you might sit here as a non-Christian. You might be a liberal backslider, or you might be a conservative who has never set foot in a cinema. But who you are and what you do is immaterial to the promises of God. His promises are his to give to you, not yours to earn. He is faithful even when you are not, because that is who he is. Now, like David, we wait for a throne to be established, but unlike the precarious and unstable and violent kingship of the 10th century BC and onwards, this eternal throne of David will be sat on by someone who isn't as vengeful as David, who is much wiser than Solomon, and whose reign will not be a violent affair, but one of peace and blessing. He may not be here yet, but the good news is that he is coming back to take it. And I pray that we'll be ready to worship at his feet when he does. Amen.